This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. I'm Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years, and on this podcast, How Did We Get Here?, I hope to provide background and context to help better understand the stories that are bombarding us every day in the news. This week, as Britain and the EU fire their opening salvos over the negotiations, what are the options for trade? What is a Canada-style deal? What's an Australia-style deal? And where does a possible American deal fit in? I've been talking about this with one of the country's best informed analysts, Sam Lowe of the Centre for European Reform. So here talking to Sam Lowe from the Centre of European Reform, a trade expert, Brexit expert with this think tank, which we're sitting in the office just a stone's throw from Parliament. So thanks very much for finding time to talk to us, Sam. Appreciate that. Let's talk the trade possibilities for Britain after Brexit, with the EU and beyond maybe. First of all, Prime Minister's given a big speech in Greenwich about what he wants to do. What can we best gauge as his ideal for a trade deal with the EU?
I think we actually are in a moment now where we have more clarity with regards to the UK's ambition for the future relationship with the EU than we've had for a long time. What the Prime Minister is asking for is a trade agreement that removes tariffs and quotas. So this would be taxes at the border or quantitative restrictions on the amount you can sell into the EU. But beyond that, does not do very much to reduce regulatory barriers to trade and customs issues. So you will still have friction at the border, and we're accepting that, and does next to nothing to facilitate trade and services to the extent we have today.
So it's quite and is this what they call a Canada-style deal?
And this is what they call a Canada-style deal. So and you could use lots of other labels. You could say it's a Japan-style deal or a Korea-style deal. So the EU has lots of trade agreements with lots of different countries. Recently with Japan, Canada, Korea. You know, you've got this long list, and these trade agreements are all slightly different, but fairly boilerplate in that the main focus is on removing tariffs. And then at the edges, you might remove some regulatory friction to trade. You might make the customs issues just a bit simpler or the like. But you accept there's still going to be a lot of friction. And then when it comes to services, again, services trade, you might do some things like make it slightly more easy for a foreign company to invest in your territory or the like, but not really that much.
So it's kind of bare bones there. I mean, it gets rid of tariffs and quotas, but you've already said there's going to be friction at the border. Now,
yes.
We've always heard about frictionless trade, or we used to hear a lot about frictionless trade in goods. That's basically what we've had as a member of the EU,
yes.
with the EU. So it's Boris Johnson saying, we accept there is going to be friction.
Well, I think he's explicitly saying that, and him and his ministers have said this on the record quite a few times now. They are saying that we accept that there is going to be friction when it comes to our future trade with the EU, and in return, we will have the domestic flexibility to regulate our economy as we see fit, and the flexibility to sign new free trade agreements with who we want. And his hope is that that flexibility will compensate for the economic losses of having a much looser relationship with the European Union.
So who are the companies, the industries that will be hearing that expression about more friction in trading with the EU who are going to be saying that is a worry?
Everyone who's trades with the EU. I think the ones that will be most concerned are those companies that actually have supply chains that run in and out of the UK. So you might import something from the EU into the UK, attach it to something else, and then send it back to the EU, and that might happen multiple times. And the reason,
so like the car makers,
or you could also think this is true of other advanced manufacturing as well. Also, there could be issues for pharmaceutical companies to do with regulation and authorization of products. How do you get you now have to get your product authorized on 2 markets rather than 1, both in the UK and in the EU. And then the other, I suppose, big industry that's going to be concerned, of course, is the services industry, particularly the city saying that Many of them have been preparing as if this is the end outcome for a while now, so they would argue that they are at least ready for this. And then, of course, farmers. We export a lot of food to the EU. At the most ambitious, there won't be any tariffs to worry about, which is great, but they're still going to have to deal with customs declarations and procedures, and also regulatory barriers to trade. So to give an example, under the arrangement that he's proposing, all products of animal origin, so say lamb or milk, entering the EU would have to enter via a veterinary border inspection post, which is a specific port of entry where they'd be subject to document checks, identity checks, and probably physical inspections as well.
But at least they wouldn't have tariffs, because that was one of the great concerns for instance, people exporting lamb into the EU.
Yes, so under the proposed deal, they wouldn't have tariffs, which is good, in that the tariffs are paid by the importer. It increases the cost of buying lamb in this instance from the EU. But these regulatory barriers would mean that there is more expense. There is more cost involved with importing from the UK than before, which could make those products less competitive on the EU market and cause people to buy it elsewhere. We'll have to see.
So basically, this does mean the Prime Minister is ready to see sections of UK industry, quite big sections of UK industry, having to face bigger problems in doing business with the EU.
Yes.
On the face of it, government's normally trying to go in the opposite direction.
It is, but I suppose Brexit's never been an economic discussion. I think most people would admit that if you did what all the big companies wanted to do, if you did what all the economists told you to do, Brexit would never have happened. So in a sense, this is just the inevitable end point of this discussion, in which the Prime Minister has prioritised, I suppose, perceptions of sovereignty, the ability to regulate how he sees fit, over the immediate economic consequences of putting up trade barriers with our most important economic partner.
So there will be trade barriers, even if we can do this Canada-style zero tariff, zero quota type deal. There will still be barriers to Britain trading with the EU
Absolutely.
market.
And when it comes to services, they will be quite big, although less visible. It's not very good television to go and record some lawyers resitting some exams in Dublin. That's how barriers to trade and services materialise. It's not quite as explosive as a big queue backing up from Dover.
But actually, it's a bigger part of the economy for us.
Bigger part of the economy as a whole, but in terms of trade, we do actually, if you go off the official statistics, and services trade is notoriously poorly covered and served by statistics at the moment because it's difficult to measure. But goods trade is still more important for the UK economy than services, despite services being more important for the economy as a whole.
But in terms of even getting that zero tariffs and zero trade deal, why wouldn't the EU say, okay, that's fine, we'll just sign up for that?
So this is where it gets interesting, in that the final destination, this trade agreement, is a relationship that the EU can countenance. It was on their staircase. It's the Canada-style free trade agreement. The issue the UK has here when it comes to actually getting the EU to agree to this isn't the nature of that trade agreement. It's the preconditions the EU is putting in place that it says the UK will need to agree to in order to get such a deal. And there are four, I would say. The EU is asking the UK for continued access to British fishing waters as a condition of them agreeing to this trade agreement. They are asking the UK to agree not to roll back existing labour and environmental protections as a precondition for this trade agreement. And they are asking the UK to continue to follow EU state aid rules. So these are the rules that govern how and when you can subsidise private industry. They want
bail out a company or something like that.
Yes, exactly. How they want us to commit to follow those EU rules into the future, which is obviously creating some problems because we're saying, well, we're leaving your rules, I don't want to keep following them. And then also the other issue is just what role does the European Court of Justice play in all of this when it comes to mediating or its involvement with disputes between the UK and the EU. And these are contentious issues, but this is where the actual negotiation is. It isn't necessarily about this nature of this final trade agreement. Of course, there'll be quibbles, but it's a model that the EU has dealt with before. We broadly know what it can and can't do. The issue is that they're asking more of the UK to enter into such a trade agreement than they would of other countries, because they say the UK is a big economy and it's nearby. Unlike, say, Japan, which is what they have a similar free trade agreement with, but it's a big economy but far away. Or Canada, which is a medium-sized economy and far away. They're saying the UK is a unique case.
And a number of Brexit supporting MPs, for instance, going back a little way, are now saying the EU is actually going back on what they said they would give us in the past. I think, you know, they said there was originally a free trade deal offered when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and now the EU is saying we're going to drive an even harder bargain. Is there any truth in that?
It's only a surprise if you've not been paying attention over the last 3 years. The EU has consistently said throughout this process that yes, they will negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK. One of their initial conditions was so long as we have different provisions for Northern Ireland. That has now been dealt with via the withdrawal agreement, but also they've always said that we would place stricter conditions on it than we would of Japan or Canada, because you're big and nearby. This isn't a new thing, and even in the political declaration, which was a document that accompanied the withdrawal agreement, which led to the UK leaving the EU, it acknowledged that there would be specific conditions placed on the UK. And
on the face of it, the Prime Minister, for instance, in that speech in Greenwich, has said, well, we're not signing up to any of that.
Right. So this is the negotiation, you know, and also we're going to hear things from the EU side where they even say they want more than this.
Like President Macron, for instance.
Yeah, of course. You know, the way I sort of would say, what I would say is we're in the chest beating phase of the negotiations. Both parties saying, well, this is what I want and what I'm prepared to give, and you know, for a while you just shout at each other.
Okay.
And then I think later in the year is when we start to go with what's the compromise here. And if you look at the history of the Brexit negotiations when it came to the UK's withdrawal, what we see is that the UK ends up having to move quite a lot, but the EU still has to move a little.
Okay, all right. Well, before we get to that, one of the other sort of models, we've had Canada, one of the other countries being cited recently is Australia, and the Prime Minister again explicitly referred to this in his big speech. What is the Australian model of a trade deal with the EU?
So Australia doesn't have a free trade agreement with the European Union. It trades with the EU on the basis of its WTO commitments.
World Trade
Organization commitments, which is the default with which a country trades with the rest of the world in the absence of a free trade agreement or the like. Australia has a few other smaller agreements with the EU that maybe reduce costs for businesses, but what we're seeing here is just government trying to dress up the idea of not having a trade agreement with the EU. Because why have they used Australia? Because Brits like Australians, it sounds nice.
So if people hear the word Australia-style deal with the EU, should they hear no deal?
They should, well, not no deal in the context of which we've discussed over the last few years, where that referred to not having a withdrawal agreement. Because obviously it would be different here. There's provisions in place for Northern Ireland, there's issues dealt with around money. But what he's saying is, we will not have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And I suppose a point to make here is that whilst Australia doesn't have a free trade agreement with the European Union, it wants one. It's currently negotiating one with the EU. So it's
meanwhile, we're holding up the possibility of what Australia has now, which it doesn't want, as our future relationship.
Exactly. And it's politics, I suppose.
Okay. Now, the big argument you hear also is, at the end of the day, the EU sells us much more than we sell to them. They're always going to want to do a deal to safeguard that trade, because that's jobs in Germany and France and places like that. That is what we've got on our side. What do you make of that?
So the German car makers are going to force the EU's hand. I don't know what it is about the last 3 years that make people think that argument still holds any weight. There's been no evidence of the EU putting its economic concerns over its political concerns when it comes to its negotiations with the UK. Yes, of course, leaving the EU, the UK and EU failing to reach a free trade agreement will be bad for the EU economy as well. It'd be bad for the UK economy too. And what the EU would say, and I think they're right, is it'd be worse for the UK, because whilst they do sell us more than we sell them, it actually accounts for a much smaller proportion of their overall GDP than the UK's. So,
but nevertheless, if at the end of the day it might mean some jobs lost in Germany, what is the downside for the EU in not going along with the basic free trade, so zero tariff, zero quota agreement.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So their fear is that without these preconditions, the UK might engage in competitive deregulation so as to get a competitive advantage, so as to allow businesses located in the UK to have a competitive advantage over those similar businesses that are based in the EU. So they're worried that the UK, with this tariff-free deal, could entice companies into the UK by saying, well, we're going to lower environmental standards, we're going to lower labour standards, we're going to give you loads of money and subsidise you. And they're worried it could just lead to this Singapore on Thames type model that people have discussed in the past. I don't actually think their concerns are that valid. I don't think the UK is that there is actually that much desire for deregulation in the UK. When you see surveys on the public, broadly quite like the regulatory balance at the moment. There's always pick at a few things, and the labour market's already quite flexible, so what would you do?
But then from the other, is it almost as if the Prime Minister again is insisting on, I want the principal to be able to do something which I have no intention of doing, i.e. sort of deregulating and going down.
Well, of course, and that's going to be much the case regardless, because if you actually think about when it comes to, say, product standards and the like, the UK, no matter the relationship, isn't going to diverge that much from the EU. The EU is the big economy in the region. It's what we call a regulatory superpower. When it sets rules, other countries start following them out of convenience, because it makes it easier to sell into that market, even if there's no agreement in place. And the UK, for the most part, will just continue to follow EU rules. But I suppose this is where it gets to the sovereignty argument. It's the principle. It's being able to say, well, we could change them if we wanted to. But the problem is that to get to that place where you can say, well, we could change them, you have to incur quite large costs. We have to accept that there's going to be this friction to trade, there's going to be these trade barriers.
So how much are you prepared to pay in that sense for your principle?
Yes.
Let's move on to the other. There's the EU sitting there, we've talked about Australia and Canada type deals. Of course, there's the American deal, which we hear a lot about. Is it possible to pursue these at the same time? Or do you have to end up choosing, certainly perhaps in the regulatory regimes between the EU and America?
Well, the UK, the British government currently, so long as its position doesn't change, has already chosen. It says, well, we accept there's going to be regulatory friction to trade with the EU because we want the ability to change our rules. So in a way, it's already saying we are going to be in a place where we can accept US demands, and we accept there's a cost to that when it comes to our trade with the EU. So is it possible for the UK to negotiate something with the US in tandem with the EU? Of course it's possible. I personally think it's going to be quite difficult, because some of the things the US are asking of the UK are controversial in the UK context, independent of the EU. So issues around food safety, issues around patent extensions for medicines, issues around the way the NHS procures medicine and how much it's willing to pay for drugs. These are all things that are in and of themselves
going to be tricky anyway,
regardless of the EU. So I think doing a trade agreement with the US at the same time as the EU is possible. The UK is going to have the flexibility to do that, and yes, it will come with a cost, but the Prime Minister at the moment says he's prepared to pay that. But I still don't expect there'll be one done this year.
Right, okay. And would the benefits of an American trade deal outweigh the losses from making it harder for us to do business with the EU, for instance?
Not according to every credible economic model that exists under the sun. You have to go to some really sort of dark places of the internet to find some evidence for that to be true. In terms of the government's own modelling, they think a trade agreement with the US, at least the modelling that's been published, I'm sure they've done some more that we haven't seen yet, but the older stuff from 2018, I think it was, they said a trade agreement with the US could benefit could mean that GDP in the long run was 0.1 to 0.3% higher than it would have been otherwise. When you look at all the modelling on the consequences of Brexit, you're talking of a range of GDP losses between 2 and 6%. Roughly. So
quite a difference. So
it's quite a difference, and this is everyone who works on trade, so me and others, we all know that trade agreements don't actually do that much for GDP. So if you think about the EU's trade agreement with Canada, it's a good agreement. I think it's good. I'm glad they have it. If you then look at when they model the long-term benefits of that, so in 15 years' time, the EU economy will be 0.03% bigger than it would have been otherwise.
Okay, so why does everyone put so much store by these trade agreements? Why do we need them? Maybe the Prime Minister's right, we could get away with just Australia style.
So when it comes to the EU relationship, it's because we're talking about at least the status quo being a much higher level of integration than is possible through a trade agreement. So when we discuss the UK leaving the EU, we're less talking about pulling out a trade agreement and more talking about pulling Birmingham out of the UK. Right, just in terms of the regulatory integration and how much progress we've made on removing barriers to trade. You know, as you said earlier, it's largely frictionless trade in goods. If you're a services provider, you can pretty much sell all over the EU as so long as you can speak all of the languages, you know, and the like. So it's just a category error to put them in the same context. But why do trade agreements why are they valuable? Because even a small bit of extra growth is a good thing. So they're a good thing, and they cement political cooperation between countries. I'm quite pro free trade agreements. I just think we should be realistic about
what they can deliver.
What they can deliver and what they can't. And why are they so important in the Brexit debate? It's because they are political trophies. They are examples of something we can do now that we couldn't do when we were a member of the EU.
Right.
So
because we're now independent.
Because we're now independent. It's a trophy to put on your mantelpiece.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Now, you said a little while ago now that you could see, I'm paraphrasing you, the shape of a deal maybe in the future. Mm-hmm. What do you think that will look like?
So I think it's quite possible. I think nothing's really going to move in the next few months. I think everyone's just going to be quite angry. But I think later in the year, I can see, so the third quarter of the year, I think the EU and UK will negotiate a free trade agreement. And we should remember,
zero tariff, zero quota?
Potentially. There may be one of the consequences of the UK not wanting to sign up to some of these flanking measures, these preconditions, is that there's tariffs in some areas. But I think that's true. And we should remember that the trade agreement is just one part of a much broader partnership, which includes cooperation on security and defence and the like. And then my question then is, okay, so if we do have this free trade agreement signed, ready to go by the end of the year, do we move to it overnight? So on January the 1st, 2021, do we go from the status quo as it exists today to this free trade agreement, which, as we've discussed, comes with a lot more border friction, lots more restrictions than exists today, and in practice would look to many people as if we'd have left without a deal at all, because the practical implications at the border would be the same. So I think that later this year, some of the discussion, if this trade agreement does get negotiated, some of the discussion will move to questions of whether it can be implemented gradually. Is it possible to move from where we are now to where we want to be in the future slowly?
Okay, because in theory it's a cut-off on December 31st.
Because in theory it's a cliff edge.
Because the Prime Minister or without said we will not be extending the negotiations, so it's either done or it's not done.
So I really don't think the Prime Minister will extend the transition period. The deadline for requesting that is July the 1st. I don't think he'll do that, but I do wonder if, when a deal has been put in place and he can say we've got this, a discussion is had as to whether they want all of that new friction to come in overnight, or if it's possible to drag it out a little while.
Do you think both sides will be happy to drag it out?
I think potentially there are three questions there that need to be answered. The one is, does the UK want to ask for it? The Prime Minister might just decide, well, actually, if there's going to be pain, we may as well just get it over with. And it's early on in his premiership. He has another 4 years to make up for it if people are upset. So the UK has to ask for it. The EU then has to say yes. Not a given. It's in the EU.
Every government has to say yes.
Not necessarily, okay. depending on what this continuity looks like. I'm not talking about the full transition period, maybe just elements of it, so it depends. But the EU has to take a decision as to whether they want Brexit to look like it hurts or not. Because if you drag it out for a long period of time, yes, the UK economy is slightly smaller than it would have been if the UK had remained in the EU, but it's still richer. We're still richer than we are now, so maybe no one notices. And maybe politically it's useful for them to have a moment where they can say, look, that hurt.
Because there's maybe trucks stacked up at the border.
Exactly, and then they've always got that moment to say that's what leaving the EU means. No one else should do it. So the EU has to say yes. And then the third question is just a practical one of how do you actually phase in pain? It's quite common in trade agreements to phase in reductions of tariffs or the like. So say the EU-Japan agreement phases in tariff reduction over 7 years. So it starts off at 10 and goes down to 8 after 1 year. That's quite common. But how do you phase in friction? How do you phase in costs for business? I'm sure you can do it, it's just it has to be worked out. So there's that practical question as well. But I do think this discussion will be had later in the year, so long as a trade agreement is pretty much in sight.
And so finally, to sum it up, you think a deal is there to be done, and a deal that could work more or less for both sides?
Is it the optimal relationship, in my opinion, for the UK and EU? No. I think
Which is membership of the EU, presumably.
Well, let's just assume that's out of the question now. We've left the EU, but I think you could point to other models of a relationship where the UK would remain more highly integrated in certain areas. So say the Swiss relationship, where it's largely in the single market for goods, which reduces much of the regulatory cost. Is that something the EU will offer? Maybe not, but I think the UK should have gone for it. So
would that even have been on offer because the Prime Minister is making it clear he doesn't want to?
No, this is it. This is it. So the UK would have to change what it wanted to get there. So that's what, so I have that question there. But is this an agreement that the UK and EU could both live with? Is it something that can be negotiated? Yes, it is.
Sam tweets as @SamuelMark with a C, Lowe, and I think he and the Centre for European Reform are going to be kept very busy for the next few months. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News, and if you have any thoughts on this or future potential podcasts, email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk.